The bell above the diner door chimed, and every conversation in the room dropped to a whisper. Jack Mercer stepped inside, 6'4", 240 pounds of scarred muscle wrapped in cracked leather. His beard had gone silver at the edges, and the tattoos running up both arms told stories most people didn't want to hear. He'd been out of Ridgemont Federal Correctional for 26 months now, but the world still hadn't decided what to do with him, and frankly, neither had he. He walked to the last booth in the row, the one by the window where nobody else ever sat. The vinyl seat groaned under his weight. A waitress approached mid-60s, her hand trembling, just enough to make the coffee pot rattle against its handle. "Coffee?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "Please, ma'am?" He always said please. He always said ma'am. Two words that felt like penance every single time. The coffee came black and bitter, and Jack wrapped both hands around the cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. The diner smelled of bacon grease and old linoleum, and the morning light cut through the blinds in pale stripes that made everything look like a faded photograph. Two women sat at the counter 3 stools apart from each other, close enough to talk without raising their voices. Jack wasn't trying to listen. He never tried. But the diner was small, and sound carried the way secrets do in places where everybody knows everybody else's business. "That poor little girl," the first woman said. She stirred her coffee in slow circles, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. Emma rose, 6 years old and already been through more than most people face in a lifetime. "4th foster home this year," the second woman replied. She was younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked at the hospital up the road. "Nobody wants to take on a child in a wheelchair. They see the medical bills, the equipment, the therapy appointments, and they just walk away." And her mother, the first woman, lowered her voice, though not enough. "Cancer took her last spring." Emma was right there beside her until the very end, held her hand in the hospice room. 6 years old, holding her dying mother's hand. The second woman shook her head slowly. "I saw her at the hospital last week during my shift. She was in the pediatric ward making paper hearts for the other kids, cutting them out with those little safety scissors, writing messages on each one. 'Get well soon. You're brave. God loves you.' Every single heart had a different message."
Yeah, it's bad.
Jack's fingers tightened around his coffee cup.
What do we do?
Something was happening in his
We're on our
chest, a
way
pressure
out.
that had nothing to do with the caffeine. He knew what it felt like to be passed around unwanted. His own childhood had been a revolving door of relatives who kept him just long enough to cash the government check before finding a reason to send him somewhere else. But at least he could run. At least he had legs that worked, legs that eventually carried him straight into the arms of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, where being angry and abandoned was practically a job qualification. "She's got this thing," she says. The first woman continued, a sad smile in her voice.
We're almost there.
"Tells everyone that her mommy promised her a new daddy would come find her someday. Says it with such certainty, like she's waiting for a bus that's just running a few minutes late." The words landed on Jack like stones dropped from a height. He set down his coffee, unfinished. His hands were shaking, and he pressed them flat against the table to make them stop.
Take this.
He pulled out his wallet,
means you
dropped a
are one
20
of us
beside the
now.
untouched cup, and stood up.
Thank
The
you.
booth sighed with relief.
Good.
At the door, he
You are
paused.
protected.
The old Jack would have walked out and kept
I
walking.
won't let you down.
The old Jack would have told himself it wasn't
on
his
tight,
problem,
kid. We're
that the
moving
world
out.
was full of sad stories, and he had enough of his own.
I know.
But something about a
Just keep
6-year-old
your
girl
eyes on me.
making paper hearts in a hospital bed,
Good.
while the
Here
world
we
kept
go.
failing her over and over, that wasn't
No one
something he
touches
could
the
walk
child.
away from.
Why should we
Not
trust
anymore.
you with it?
Not after everything
Because I
he'd
give my
already
word.
walked away from.
Your word
His boots
means
hit the
nothing
sidewalk,
here.
and instead of
It
turning
will
right toward the
today.
garage where he worked,
The child
he
is
turned
under my
left towards St.
protection.
Augustine's Hospital. The hospital lobby was
Hey,
everything Jack's world
time
was
to go.
not. Clean lines, soft colors, the hum of fluorescent lights,
will be
and the
safe.
whisper of rubber-soled
Stay
shoes on
close.
polished tile. A woman at the reception desk looked up as he approached, and he watched her expression cycle through surprise, concern, and the careful neutrality that people adopted when they didn't want to seem afraid. "I'm here to visit a patient," he said. Emma Rose Whitfield. "Are you family?" The question felt like a door slamming. "No, ma'am, just visiting." She typed something into her computer, glanced at his face one more time, and pointed toward the elevators. "Room 312, 3rd floor." The elevator was too small and too bright. Jack caught his reflection in the steel doors, a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts of a harder world. The scar across his left eyebrow from a bar fight in Tucson. The Iron Cross tattoo on his neck that he'd gotten at 19 and had regretted ever since. The hands too big, too rough, too marked with the evidence of violence. The doors opened onto a corridor painted in pale yellow, the color of weak sunshine. A bulletin board displayed children's artwork, bright and hopeful explosions of crayon against white paper. Jack's boots squeaked against the floor as he walked, and he tried to step lighter, tried to take up less space, tried to be something other than what he so obviously was. Room 312 had a small window in the door. Through it, he could see drawings taped to every wall, splashes of color that turned the sterile room into something approaching alive. And there in the middle of it all sat a girl in a wheelchair. Small, so impossibly small, dark curls framing a face that seemed to be made entirely of brightness. She was cutting something out of construction paper, her tongue poking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Jack's hand hovered over the door handle. Every instinct he'd developed over 58 years of hard living told him to turn around. He had no business being here. He had nothing to offer this child. He was a mechanic with a criminal record in a one-bedroom apartment above a garage, and the sum total of his experience with children was approximately zero. "Come in," a small voice called from inside. "I can see your shadow." Jack pushed the door open. The room smelled of crayons in the faint antiseptic sweetness that clung to everything in the hospital. Stuffed animals lined the windowsill like a jury of plush witnesses. Morning light fell across the floor in a warm rectangle, and Emma Rose Whitfield sat in the center of it, looking up at him with eyes that held absolutely no fear. She wheeled herself forward fast, the chair moving with the confidence of someone who'd been using it long enough for it to become an extension of her body. She stopped right in front of him, close enough that he could see the freckles scattered across her nose like tiny constellations. "You came," she said. Her voice was clear and certain, the voice of someone stating a fact rather than expressing surprise.
Buddy, having a good time?
"I knew you would." Jack stood there, frozen his mind, trying to catch up with reality. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected tears or fear, or the guarded silence of a child who'd learned not to trust strangers. Instead, this little girl was looking at him the way you look at someone you've been waiting for. Emma stretched out her arms, and before Jack could think, before he could calculate or hesitate or retreat, he was kneeling on the hospital floor, and her arms were around his neck, and she was holding on with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. "Mommy said you'd come find me," she whispered against his shoulder. "She said my daddy was out there somewhere, and he'd come when it was time." Jack's arms hung at his sides. His throat had closed completely. The room blurred at the edges, and he realized with distant shock that his eyes were burning. No one had hugged him in years. No one had touched him with anything approaching tenderness since before the prison gates closed behind him. And now this child, this tiny radiant child, was holding on to him like he was the answer to a prayer he didn't know anyone had been praying. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only kneel there on the cold hospital floor while a 6-year-old girl with legs that didn't work showed him what it felt like to be believed in. Jack made it to the hallway before his legs gave out. He leaned against the wall, pressing his forehead to the cool surface, breathing like a man who'd just been pulled from deep water. His hands were shaking again, and this time he didn't try to stop them. She does that to people. He turned to find an elderly nurse watching him with knowing eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read Clara Brennan. She had the kind of face that had seen everything and decided to be kind about it anyway. "I've never," Jack started, then stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence. He didn't know what he'd never done because the list was so long, it stretched back to childhood. Clara Brennan smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't ask anything in return. "Emma sees things the rest of us miss, always has. Even when she was going through the worst of it, losing her mother, being moved from home to home, she kept saying that her person was coming. That's what she calls it, her person." "I'm not," Jack said. "I can't be what she thinks I am." Clara tilted her head, studying him the way a doctor studies an X-ray, looking for what lies beneath the surface. "Can't you?" He didn't have an answer for that. He left the hospital with Emma's words echoing in his skull like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "Mommy said you'd come." He rode his motorcycle home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but felt completely different, as though someone had shifted the entire world 3 inches to the left while he wasn't looking. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like cooking oil and old carpet. 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a shower that only ran hot for 6 minutes, a kitchen where the refrigerator hummed a constant low note of complaint. He'd lived here for 2 years, and the place still looked temporary, as though he might leave at any moment and take nothing with him because there was nothing worth taking. He sat on the couch, a salvaged piece of furniture with a permanent sag in the middle, and stared at the wall. The only decoration was a photograph in a cheap frame, the kind you buy at a dollar store. It showed a younger Jack standing with a group of men in leather vests, the Iron Wolves insignia stitched across their backs. They were all grinning the kind of dangerous, reckless grin that comes from believing you're invincible. Jack recognized every face. 2 were dead now. 3 were in prison. 1 had disappeared so completely that even the FBI had stopped looking. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at his hands, the same hands that had hurt people, the same hands that a little girl had just wrapped her arms around without a moment's hesitation. He went back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. On the 4th visit, he brought a red toy car small enough to fit in his palm, its paint glossy and bright. He'd stood in the toy aisle of the drugstore for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the sheer volume of options, before settling on the simplest thing he could find. He held it out to Emma the way someone might hold out a peace offering, uncertain and hopeful. Her eyes went wide. "It's so pretty. Can we race?" They raced toy cars across the hospital floor for 2 hours. Emma showed him how to use the lines between the floor tiles as a track, how to make proper engine sounds, how to create elaborate backstories for each vehicle. The red car was a champion racer named Lightning. The blue one that Clara brought from the playroom was a detective car named Mystery. Jack's attempts at engine noises came out more like growls, and Emma laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her wheelchair. It was the sound of her laughter that broke something open inside him. Not broke as in damaged, but broke as in released, the way ice breaks on a river in spring, letting everything flow again after a long, frozen silence. He started learning. At night in his apartment, he read books about caring for children with spinal cord injuries, medical terminology that looked like a foreign language, physical therapy protocols, nutritional requirements, wheelchair specifications. He filled a notebook with questions in his rough handwriting and brought them to Clara, who answered each one with patience and warmth. Her wheelchair, Clara told him one afternoon while Emma napped. "It's 3 sizes too small for her now. She's growing and the old one is causing pressure sores. But the funding keeps getting delayed and the foster system moves slower than molasses in January." Jack looked at Emma's wheelchair parked beside her bed. The pink paint was chipped. 1 wheel squeaked with every rotation, and the seat cushion was compressed thin as a pancake. He imagined Emma spending every day in that chair, her body aching, her skin raw, and never once complaining about it. That night, Jack sat in his apartment and stared at the one thing he owned that was worth real money: his motorcycle. A 1998 Harley-Davidson Road King Black in chrome, the engine rebuilt twice by his own hands. It was the last piece of his old life, the last connection to the Iron Wolves, the last object that still held the ghost of who he used to be. He called a buyer the next morning. The motorcycle sold for $4,700. Jack counted the bills twice, folded them into his jacket pocket, and walked to the medical supply store on 5th Street. He spent 3 days researching, comparing, testing. He talked to physical therapists, occupational therapists, other parents of children with disabilities. He found through an online forum. He measured twice. He checked 3 times. When he walked into Emma's room pushing a brand new wheelchair, purple, her favorite color, with proper cushioning and responsive wheels and armrests at exactly the right height, Emma's face did something that Jack would remember for the rest of his life. It didn't just light up, it ignited. Every ounce of joy that 6-year-old body could contain came flooding out through her eyes and her smile and her voice, which rose to a pitch that probably registered on equipment 3 floors down. "Is that for me? Is that really for me?" "All yours, kiddo." Clara helped Emma transfer into the new chair, and the moment she was settled, she took off across the room like a small purple rocket. The chair responded to every touch, smooth and quick, and Emma spun and rolled and laughed until she was breathless. "Look how fast I can go. Look, look, look." Jack stood with his back against the wall watching her, and the feeling in his chest was so enormous and so unfamiliar that for a moment he thought he might be having a heart attack. But it wasn't that. It was something far more dangerous. Clara appeared beside him and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You sold your motorcycle," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You did good, Jack," Clara whispered. "You did real good." He came every single day after that. Rainshine, weekdays, weekends. The nurses stopped flinching when he appeared. Sarah, the young nurse with the braids, started saving him a cup of coffee at the station. Old Bill at the security desk began greeting him by name instead of reaching for his radio. The hospital garden became their cathedral. Every afternoon, weather permitting, Jack would push Emma's wheelchair down the winding concrete paths between flower beds that the hospital volunteers maintained with obsessive devotion. Tulips and spring roses and summer chrysanthemums when fall came. Emma knew the name of every flower, every tree, every bird that landed on the feeders near the pond. "That's a cardinal," she'd announced, pointing at a flash of red in the bushes. "The boys are red and the girls are brown. Miss Clara told me." "Is that right? And did you know they mate for life? That means they stay together forever." Jack pushed the wheelchair in silence for a few moments, listening to the crunch of gravel under the wheels, the distant murmur of traffic beyond the hospital walls.
Thanks.
The word forever hung between them like something fragile and sacred. They fed the ducks together. Emma tossing bread from a bag she'd saved from breakfast, her arm getting stronger each day from the therapy exercises Jack helped her practice. They watched butterflies, and once a monarch landed on the armrest of Emma's wheelchair and stayed there for a full 2 minutes, opening and closing its wings like a tiny silent ovation. Emma didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat perfectly still with her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open, holding the moment as gently as you'd hold water in cup in hands. "She likes me," Emma whispered. "Everybody likes you, kiddo." At the pond, Emma asked him the question she'd been circling for days. "Jack, did you ever have a little girl before?" He knelt beside her wheelchair, so they were at the same height. The ducks glided across the water, leaving small wakes behind them. "No, Emma, I never did." "Then how do you know how to be a daddy?" Jack thought about this for a long time. The honest answer was that he didn't know. The honest answer was that he was figuring it out minute by minute, making mistakes constantly, and relying on Clara and library books in a desperate, consuming need not to fail this child the way every other adult in her life had failed her. But he looked at Emma's face, earnest and trusting, and he said the only thing that felt true. "I think you're teaching me." She smiled at that, the big, full-body smile that started in her eyes and worked its way down to her toes. "That's okay, I'm a good teacher. Miss Clara says so." He learned Emma's therapy exercises and helped her through them, his massive hands impossibly gentle as he supported her small limbs through each movement. He learned which stories she liked best and which voices to use for which characters. He learned that she hated green peas but loved carrots, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but pretended not to be, that she needed to hear "Goodnight Moon" twice before she could fall asleep. He learned that she made paper hearts for every new patient on the pediatric floor, that she knew every nurse's name and birthday, that she sang to herself when she thought no one was listening, always the same song, a lullaby her mother used to sing about a ship sailing toward the morning star. And slowly, so slowly that he barely noticed it happening, the walls he'd built around himself over 58 years began to thin. Not crumble, not fall, but thin, like ice held up to the sun, becoming transparent enough for light to pass through. One afternoon, as Jack was helping Emma with her arm exercises, she stopped mid-movement and looked at him with that direct searchlight gaze that children have before the world teaches them to look away. "Jack, yeah, kiddo, are you going to stay forever?" The question hit him somewhere below the ribs. He looked at this girl, this extraordinary, impossible, luminous girl who had been abandoned by everyone the world had assigned to care for her, and who still believed that love was coming. "I'm going to be here as long as you need me, Emma. I promise." She held up her pinky finger, small as a candle wick. "Pinky promise, right?" Jack looked at her tiny finger, then he extended his own, scarred and calloused and tattooed across every knuckle. The contrast was almost absurd, but when their fingers linked, something locked into place that felt permanent, felt foundational, felt like the first solid thing Jack had stood on in decades. Pinky promise. The days took on a rhythm, and rhythm was something Jack had never had before. Mornings at the garage where he rebuilt engines and replaced brake pads and tried not to watch the clock. Afternoons at the hospital where the hours disappeared inside the gravity of Emma's smile. Evenings in his apartment reading about spinal cord injuries and childhood development and the thousand things a father needs to know. A father. The word still felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he was learning too late in life. But Emma used it easily, naturally, the way she used her wheelchair, as though it had always been part of her world. Daddy, look at this picture I drew. Daddy, can you make the bear voice again? Daddy, my arm is tired. Can we take a break? Each time she said it, something recalibrated inside him. Some needle on some internal gauge swung a little further toward a direction he had never traveled. Clara watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has spent 4 decades caring for children and has learned to recognize love in all its unlikely disguises. You're different with her, Clara told him one evening as they sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking bad coffee while Emma slept. I don't mean different from who you were. I mean different from everyone else who's come through her life. The foster parents, the social workers, even the doctors. They all looked at Emma and saw a problem to manage. You look at her and see a person to love. Jack stared into his coffee. I don't know what I'm doing, Clara. Half the time I'm terrified I'm going to break her. Babies are resilient, and Emma is the most resilient person I've ever met, child or adult. Clara set down her cup. But I didn't come here to talk about Emma. I came to talk about you. Jack looked up. The social worker, Mrs. Thompson, she's been asking questions. About you, about your visits. The system has its eye on you, Jack, and not just because of your record. Clara paused. They see what's happening between you and Emma. Some of them think it's beautiful. Others think it's a liability. What do you think? Clara smiled. I think that little girl was right. I think you are exactly who she's been waiting for. It was Clara who first showed him the photograph. She brought it in a manila envelope one morning, setting it on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of someone delivering evidence. The hospital keeps patients' personal effects in storage, Clara explained. When Emma's mother passed, her belongings were boxed up. I was cataloging them for the social worker when I found this. Jack opened the envelope and slid out a photograph, creased and faded its corners, soft with age. It showed a woman young, maybe late 20s, standing beside a broken-down car on a dusty shoulder of highway. She was visibly pregnant, one hand resting on her belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. And beside her, bent under the open hood of the car, with a wrench in his hand, was a man in a leather vest. The Iron Wolves insignia was clearly visible on his back. Jack's blood went cold. He recognized the highway. Route 191 outside of Barstow. He recognized the car, a blue sedan with a cracked taillight. And he recognized the man under the hood because the man was him. Younger, harder still, deep in the life, but unmistakably him. I pulled over, he said, his voice barely audible. Her car had overheated. I fixed the radiator hose with duct tape and told her to get it to a shop before she drove another 50 miles. He touched the photograph with one rough finger. She was pregnant. She said she was driving to see family in Nevada. She thanked me. I told her to be safe. He looked at Clara, and the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. That was her. That was Emma's mother. Clara nodded. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, and according to the nurses who cared for her at the end, she told Emma that story many times. The story of the big, strong man who stopped on the highway to help a stranger. She told Emma that a man like that, a man who would stop for someone he didn't know, would make the best father in the world. Jack set the photograph down on the table. His hands were trembling. His vision had gone blurry, and he blinked hard once, twice, but the blur didn't clear. Because it wasn't his eyes, it was something deeper than eyes, something that lived in the part of him he'd kept locked away for so long, he'd forgotten it existed. Sarah Whitfield had remembered him. Of all the people she'd met in her short life, she had remembered a stranger on a highway who'd fixed her car and told her to be safe. And she had turned that memory into a promise for her daughter, a promise that the man would come back, that he would find Emma when Emma needed him most. And here he was. The impossibility of it sat in the room like a third person, silent and enormous. Jack looked at Clara, then at the photograph, then through the window toward the hallway that led to Emma's room, where a little girl in a purple wheelchair was probably right now cutting out paper hearts for children she'd never met, believing with every fiber of her being that the world was good, that people were good, that her daddy had come home. "What do I do?" he whispered. Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You do what you've already been doing. You show up, you love her, you fight for her." Fight for her? Clara's expression shifted, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something like worry in her eyes. "There's something you should know, Jack. Mrs. Thompson got a call this morning. Someone has come forward claiming to be Emma's relative, a man named Richard Blackwell. Says he's a cousin of Sarah's, a businessman from Seattle." The name meant nothing to Jack, but the implications hit him like a freight train. He gripped the edge of the table. "He has resources, Jack, money, lawyers, influence, and he wants custody of Emma." The room seemed to contract around him. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The coffee in his cup had gone cold without him noticing, and the photograph of a young pregnant woman and a stranger on a highway sat between them like a relic from a world that no longer existed. "He can't have her," Jack said. His voice was quiet, but the certainty in it was absolute, forged in the same furnace that had once made him dangerous and was now making him something else entirely. "Nobody's taking Emma from me." Clara squeezed his hand. "Then you need to be ready, because this fight is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done." Jack looked at the photograph one more time. Sarah Whitfield smiled up at him from a highway in the desert, her hand on her belly, her future and her daughter's future still unwritten. She had believed in him when he was at his worst. She had seen something in a man covered in gang tattoos who stopped to fix a stranger's car, and she had turned that something into a story, and that story had become a promise, and that promise had become a little girl's unshakable faith. He slid the photograph into his jacket pocket close to his heart. "I'll be ready," he said. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Jack did everything he was told to do and then did more. He enrolled in a parenting course at the community center, sitting in a circle of young mothers who tried not to stare at the tattoos climbing out of his collar. He completed a first aid certification, a CPR course, and a home safety inspection that required him to install child-proof locks on every cabinet in his apartment. He built a wheelchair ramp for the front entrance of his building, spending an entire weekend with lumber and a borrowed drill measuring and remeasuring until the angle was exactly right. He went to the courthouse and requested his own criminal record, all of it, every charge, every conviction, every sentence served. He spread the pages across his coffee table and forced himself to read every word, not flinching, not making excuses. Assault, aggravated assault, possession of a controlled substance, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, weapons charges. Each one was a stone in the wall between him and Emma, and he needed to know exactly how high that wall was before he could figure out how to climb it. The lawyer came through a legal aid referral. Harold Pemberton was 71 years old, semi-retired, with an office that smelled like pipe tobacco and old books. His hair was white as January, and his suits were 20 years out of style, but his eyes were sharp, and when Jack told him the whole story from the diner to the hospital room to the photograph on the highway, Pemberton leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "Your chances are not good," Pemberton said finally. "I won't pretend otherwise. The court favors blood relatives and it favors money. This Blackwell fellow has both, or claims to." "Claims to," Pemberton raised an eyebrow. "Something about this doesn't sit right with me. A wealthy businessman who never once reached out while the child's mother was dying of cancer suddenly appears after she's been in the system for a year. People like that don't just wake up one morning and decide to become parents. There's usually an angle. What kind of angle? That's what I intend to find out." Pemberton opened a drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "In the meantime, we build your case. Character witnesses, documentation of your relationship with Emma, medical staff testimonials. Everything." Jack nodded. "Whatever it takes." "Mr. Mercer," Pemberton said, and his voice carried the weight of 3 decades in family law, "I need you to understand something. They will come after your past. Every arrest, every conviction, every violent incident will be put on display. They will try to make you look like a monster. And you need to be ready to stand in front of a judge and own every single thing you've done without making excuses. Can you do that?" Jack looked at his hands spread flat on the desk between them. The scars across his knuckles. the faded ink, the calluses from years of turning wrenches, and before that from years of turning those same hands into weapons. "I've done terrible things," Jack said, "but I'm not that man anymore. And even if no one else believes that Emma does, that's enough for me." Pemberton studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's get to work." Richard Blackwell arrived on a Tuesday. Jack knew because Mrs. Thompson called him that morning, her voice carefully professional, informing him that Emma's relative would be visiting the hospital to meet her. Jack wanted to be there. Every cell in his body wanted to be standing in that room. But Pemberton had advised him to stay away, to let the system work to avoid any appearance of possessiveness that could be used against him in court. So instead, Jack sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, watching the front entrance like a man on a stakeout. Blackwell pulled up in a black Mercedes. He was tall, not as tall as Jack, but tall enough with silver hair that looked professionally styled and a suit that probably cost more than Jack's truck. He carried a shopping bag from a toy store, and Jack noticed that the bag was from one of those expensive boutique places, not the drugstore where Jack had bought the red car. Jack watched Blackwell disappear through the automatic doors and then sat in the silence of his truck for 45 minutes, barely breathing, until his phone rang. It was Clara. "He's gone," she said. "He stayed about 30 minutes. How was she? How was Emma?" Clara paused, and in that pause, Jack heard everything he needed to know. "She was polite. You know Emma, she's kind to everyone. But she didn't hug him, Jack. She shook his hand like a little businesswoman, showed him her drawings, answered his questions. And when he left, she asked me when you were coming." Jack closed his eyes. The relief was so intense it made him dizzy. "But Jack," Clara continued, and her voice had an edge he hadn't heard before. "Something about that man bothered me. The way he looked around the room. He wasn't looking at Emma. He was looking at her charts, her paperwork. He asked Mrs. Thompson very specific questions about Emma's mother's estate. Her estate, Sarah Whitfield, didn't have money." "No," Clara said, "but she had a life insurance policy. $2 million left in trust for Emma." The silence on the line stretched like a wire about to snap. $2 million, Jack repeated. "Managed by the state until Emma turns 18 or until a legal guardian is appointed." The pieces fell into place with the ugly precision of a loaded gun being assembled. Richard Blackwell didn't want Emma. Richard Blackwell wanted the money. Jack sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot while the sun moved across the sky and the shadows grew long and the world went on about its business. And he thought about a man in an expensive suit who saw a 6-year-old girl in a wheelchair and calculated her net worth. The rage that rose in him was not the old rage, not the wild, destructive fury that had fueled his years with the Iron Wolves. This was something different, something colder and more focused. This was the rage of a father. He called Pemberton. "I need to see you tonight," Jack said. "I think I know what Blackwell is really after." The office was dark except for the desk lamp when Jack arrived. Pemberton sat with his glasses perched on his nose, already surrounded by papers. He listened without interrupting as Jack relayed what Clara had told him. $2 million in trust, Pemberton murmured, making notes on his legal pad. Managed by the state. Appointed guardian would have access to the funds for the child's care. "He doesn't give a damn about Emma," Jack said. "He wants the money." Pemberton held up a hand. "We don't know that yet. What we know is that it's suspicious. A previously unknown relative appears shortly after a substantial trust is established. But suspicion isn't evidence, and evidence is what wins cases." "Then how do we get evidence?" Pemberton removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I have a friend, former investigator retired from the DA's office. He owes me a favor. Let me make some calls." Jack stood by the window looking out at the street below. A couple walked by, holding hands. A man carried groceries into an apartment building. The ordinary rhythms of ordinary lives. For so long, Jack had watched the world from the outside, a spectator behind glass. But now he had something to fight for, someone who needed him, and the glass was gone. "There's something else," Jack said, turning from the window. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph, the one Clara had found in Sarah's belongings. The pregnant woman. The stranger on the highway. He laid it on Pemberton's desk. The lawyer picked it up, examined it, turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "The kind man on Route 191, July 14th. He fixed my car and told me to be safe. I'll never forget his face. Pemberton looked up at Jack, then back at the photograph, then back at Jack again. His expression was unreadable. This is you. About 8 years ago, I was still riding with the Iron Wolves. I saw her car broken down on the shoulder, and I pulled over. Fixed the radiator hose with duct tape and told her to get it to a shop before she drove another 50 miles. He touched the photograph with one rough finger. She was pregnant. She said she was driving to see family in Nevada. She thanked me. I told her to be safe. He looked at Clara, and the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. That was her. That was Emma's mother. Pemberton set the photograph down gently as though it were made of something precious and fragile. And she remembered you. Told her daughter about you. Told her daughter that the man who stopped on the highway would make the best father in the world. The old lawyer sat back in his chair. In 30 years of family law, he had seen every variation of human drama, every configuration of love and loss and desperation. But he had never seen anything quite like this. A dying mother's promise reaching across years and chance, and the vast indifference of the universe finding its way to a diner in a small town where a broken man sat drinking coffee he would never finish. Mr. Mercer, Pemberton said quietly, I've been doing this a long time, and in my experience, the court doesn't believe in miracles. But I do, and this photograph, this connection between you and Emma's mother, it changes the story we can tell. He picked up his pen. Now, tell me everything. From the beginning, don't leave anything out. Jack talked for 2 hours. He told Pemberton about the Iron Wolves, about the things he'd done, about the night he'd beaten Danny Gallagher so badly that the boy had spent 3 weeks in the hospital with fractured ribs and a concussion. He told him about prison, about the silence and the walls, and the slow grinding work of becoming someone different inside a place designed to keep you exactly the same. He told him about the letters he'd written from his cell to Danny, to the people he had hurt, to the world he'd damaged, letters that were never answered, and that he kept writing anyway because the act of apology was the only tool he had for rebuilding himself. He told him about the diner and the coffee and the 2 women at the counter, about walking into Emma's room and being hugged by a child who had every reason in the world to be afraid of strangers, about learning to help with physical therapy and reading bedtime stories and buying a purple wheelchair with money from a sold motorcycle. He told him about the photograph and the highway and the pregnant woman whose car had overheated in the desert. And he told him about the way Emma said daddy, like the word itself, was a homecoming. When he finished, the room was quiet. The desk lamp hummed. Pemberton's legal pad was covered in notes, page after page, in his neat, old-fashioned handwriting. Here's what we're going to do, the lawyer said. We're going to establish your relationship with Emma as genuine, sustained, and beneficial. We're going to present your rehabilitation as real and documented, and we're going to investigate Richard Blackwell until we know every secret he's ever kept. He paused. But I need you to understand the risk. If Blackwell's lawyers dig deep enough, and they'll find everything. The Danny Gallagher incident, the weapons charges, all of it. And they'll use it. I know, Jack said. Are you prepared for that? To sit in a courtroom while strangers describe the worst things you've ever done, and to take it without flinching. Jack thought of Emma, of her small hand wrapped around his pinky finger, of the photograph in his jacket pocket close to his heart. For her, he said, I can take anything. Pemberton nodded. He stood, walked around the desk, and extended his hand. Jack shook it, feeling the old warrior's grip firm and steady. Then we fight, Pemberton said. Starting tomorrow. Jack stood at the door, his hand on the brass knob that was worn smooth from decades of clients gripping it with exactly this mixture of hope and fear. One more thing, Pemberton said from behind his desk. Emma's foster care status. Right now, she's a ward of the state. That means any petition for guardianship goes through family court, and family court judges in this county are conservative. They like tradition. They like blood ties. They like bank accounts with a lot of zeros. He paused. What they don't usually like is former convicts with gang tattoos. I know what I look like, Jack said. Then make sure the judge sees what Emma sees. That's our best weapon and maybe our only one. Jack walked through the parking lot toward his truck. The streetlights had come on, painting everything in that orange-yellow sodium glow that makes the world look like an old photograph. A car alarm was going off somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic, electronic wail that nobody would answer. He stopped walking. stood in the middle of the empty lot with his hands at his sides, looking up at the sky. The stars were invisible behind the light pollution, but he knew they were there, the same stars that shone over the desert highway where he'd once stopped to fix a stranger's car. The same stars that Emma watched from her hospital window every night before she fell asleep. He thought about probability, about the astronomical odds against any of this happening. A man walks into a diner, hears a conversation, goes to a hospital, meets a child whose mother he once helped on a highway 8 years ago. The math was impossible. The logic was impossible. And yet here he was standing in a parking lot with a lawyer's business card in his pocket and a little girl's drawings on his refrigerator, preparing for the fight of his life. Jack had never been a religious man. The Iron Wolves didn't pray, and prison had taught him that if God existed, he had a complicated relationship with justice. But standing in that parking lot thinking about Sarah Whitfield and her daughter and a broken radiator hose in the desert, Jack felt something that he had no word for except grace. He got in his truck and drove home through streets that were dark and wet with rain. The city looked different at night, softer, its hard edges dissolved by shadow and distance. He parked his truck and climbed the stairs to his apartment, his boots heavy on each step. Inside, he hung his jacket on the hook by the door and stood in the middle of his small living room. Emma's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. A stack of parenting books sat on the kitchen counter. The photograph of the Iron Wolves still hung on the wall, but beside it now was something else. A crayon drawing of 2 stick figures, one enormous and one tiny one, standing and one in a wheelchair, both smiling under a rainbow. Across the top, in wobbly letters that leaned slightly to the right, Emma had written, "My family." Jack looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he took down the photograph of the Iron Wolves, opened a drawer, and put it inside face down. He turned off the lights and went to bed. In the darkness, lying on his back with his hands folded across his chest, he thought about Sarah Whitfield on a highway in the desert, about a broken radiator hose, and a few words between strangers. He thought about how small the world was and how large, and how the things you do without thinking, the kindnesses that cost you nothing, can echo forward through years and lives and reach places you never imagined. He thought about Emma asleep in her hospital bed 3 miles away, surrounded by stuffed animals and drawings and paper hearts, dreaming whatever dreams 6-year-old girls dream when they believe with absolute certainty that they are loved. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Mercer fell asleep without fear. He dreamed of highways, of a long, straight road cutting through brown desert under a sky so blue it looked artificial, of pulling over, of a woman standing beside a car with steam rising from its hood, her hand on her belly, her face full of that peculiar combination of worry and hope that belongs exclusively to mothers, of bending under the hood while the engine ticked and cooled, of the woman watching him work, not afraid even though he was wearing the Iron Wolves vest, even though his arms were covered in ink, even though everything about him advertised danger. In the dream, he fixed the hose, closed the hood, and wiped his hands on his jeans. The woman smiled. It was a specific smile, warm and knowing, the kind of smile people give when they've decided something important about you. "You'd make a good father," she said. And in the dream, Jack Mercer's 26 months out of Ridgemont Federal, 58 years old, alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in a city that barely knew his name, answered, "I'm trying." He woke up at dawn. The light was gray and gentle, filtering through curtains he'd forgotten to close. He lay still for a moment, letting the dream dissolve, letting reality settle back into place. Then he got up, made coffee, pulled on his work clothes, and drove to the garage. At noon, he clocked out, ate a sandwich in his truck, and drove to the hospital. Emma was waiting by the window when he walked in. She turned her wheelchair around with that quick, precise motion that still amazed him, and her face broke into the smile that had become the fixed point around which his entire universe now turned. "Daddy," she said, "I made you something." She held out a paper heart cut carefully from red construction paper, slightly lopsided the edges, rough where the safety scissors had struggled through the thick paper. On it, in her wobbling handwriting, she had written 3 words. "I love you." Jack took the heart with both hands, holding it as carefully as he would hold a living thing, and he looked at his daughter, and his daughter looked at him, and the morning light fell across them both, and the world for one perfect moment was exactly as it should be. The restaurant Richard Blackwell chose for their meeting was the kind of place where the menus didn't have prices, because anyone who needed to ask couldn't afford to eat there. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across white tablecloths, and waiters moved between tables with the silent precision of people trained to be invisible. Jack sat in a chair that was probably worth more than his apartment's security deposit, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that Clara had ironed for him that morning. Blackwell was already seated when Jack arrived. He stood to shake hands, and Jack noticed immediately that the gesture was practiced a performance of courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. The man was mid-50s, lean, and polished in the way that comes from expensive gyms and carefully managed diets. His suit was charcoal gray, his watch was gold, and his smile was the kind that made you want to count your fingers after the handshake. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for meeting me. I thought we should talk before this goes any further." Man to man. Jack lowered himself into the chair across from Blackwell. A waiter appeared with water poured into crystal glasses with a cloth napkin draped over his arm and vanished. "I'll get right to it," Blackwell said. He folded his hands on the table in a way that suggested boardrooms and hostile takeovers. "I understand you've grown attached to Emma. That's admirable, truly, but let's be realistic about what we're dealing with here. Let's be. Emma needs lifelong medical care, physical therapy specialists, adaptive equipment, eventually modifications to a home, a vehicle, possibly round-the-clock assistance. We're talking about millions of dollars over the course of her childhood alone." Blackwell tilted his head, studying Jack the way a buyer studies merchandise. "You're a mechanic. You live in a one-bedroom apartment. You have a criminal record that would make most employers run for the hills. I know what I have and what I don't." Blackwell reached into his jacket and produced a checkbook. It was leather-bound, expensive, the kind of thing that announces wealth before a single number is written. "I'm prepared to make this easy for everyone. Name your price. Walk away. Let Emma have the life she deserves." Jack looked at the checkbook, then he looked at Blackwell. "You flew here from Seattle. You hired a private investigator. You've got lawyers on retainer, all for a little girl you've never met until 2 weeks ago." Something flickered behind Blackwell's eyes, a tightening barely perceptible, like a card player hearing one too many questions about his hand. "She's family," Blackwell said smoothly. "When I learned about her situation, I felt a moral obligation. Funny kind of moral obligation that shows up a year after her mother died." The tightening again. Then the smile returned wider and less convincing. "I didn't know about Emma until recently. These things take time to uncover." "Sure they do." Jack stood up. The chair legs scraped against the floor and a few nearby diners turned to look. "Keep your checkbook, Mr. Blackwell. Emma's not for sale." Blackwell's mask slipped for just a moment, and what Jack saw underneath was not the face of a concerned relative. It was the face of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted and deeply irritated by the prospect of not getting it this time. "You're making a mistake," Blackwell said. His voice had lost its polish. "What judge in this country is going to give custody to a convicted felon over a successful businessman? I guess we'll find out." Jack turned and walked out of the restaurant, past the crystal and the white linen, and the waiters who pretended not to stare into the evening air that felt clean and cold against his face. In his truck, he sat for 5 minutes with his hands on the steering wheel, breathing. The old anger was there, coiled in his belly like a snake, but he didn't let it out. Not this time. This time the anger had a purpose, and the purpose had a name, and the name was Emma. The first hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Jack wore the suit Pemberton had loaned him, gray wool that smelled faintly of mothballs and was tight across the shoulders. He'd trimmed his beard the night before, and Clara had helped him cover the tattoo on his neck with a high collar, though nothing could be done about the ink that crept up from his wrists. The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, rows of benches that looked like church pews, stripped of their faith. Judge Martha Calloway sat at the bench, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and an expression that suggested she had heard every lie the human race was capable of telling and was no longer impressed by any of them. Blackwell's legal team took up one side of the aisle like an occupying army. 3 lawyers in matching dark suits, each with a leather briefcase and a laptop, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from billing $400 an hour. Blackwell himself sat behind them, posture-perfect, face arranged in an expression of compassionate concern that Jack recognized immediately as theatrical. On Jack's side, there was Pemberton. Just Pemberton, with his Yellow legal in his 20-year-old suit, and his 71 years of not being impressed by wealth. Blackwell's lead attorney went first. He was smooth practiced, his arguments flowing like water over polished stone. He presented financial statements, property records, letters of recommendation from business associates, a plan for Emma's care that included the country's top pediatric specialists, the finest private schools, a custom-built, accessible home in an upscale Seattle neighborhood. My client is prepared to provide Emma Rose with every advantage, the lawyer concluded. Medical care of the highest caliber, educational opportunities without limit, and the stability of a permanent home with a blood relative. Jack listened with his hands folded in his lap, his jaw tight. Every word was designed to make him feel small, to make his one-bedroom apartment and his mechanic's salary and his criminal record look like insurmountable evidence of unfitness. And the worst part was that some of it was true. He couldn't match Blackwell's resources. He couldn't offer a mansion or a team of specialists or a trust fund. Then Pemberton stood up. The old lawyer moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he knows that speed is the enemy of truth. Your Honor, my client, Jack Mercer, is not a wealthy man. He won't pretend to be. He's a mechanic. He lives modestly. And yes, he has a criminal record, a record he will address openly and honestly, because that is who Jack Mercer is now, a man who owns his mistakes. Pemberton paused, letting the silence do its work. But this case is not about money. It is about a child. A 6-year-old girl who has been failed by every system designed to protect her. A girl who has been through 4 foster homes in 1 year. A girl whose mother died in a hospice while Emma held her hand. And in the middle of all that loss, all that abandonment, Emma Rose found one person who showed up. Every single day, rain or shine. Not because he was paid to, not because he was obligated to, but because he chose to. Pemberton turned to look at Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell appeared in Emma's life 3 weeks ago. Mr. Mercer has been at her side for 4 months. He learned her physical therapy routines. He sold his only valuable possession, a motorcycle, to buy her a wheelchair that fits properly. He reads her stories every night. He knows her favorite color is purple. He knows she's afraid of thunderstorms. He knows she sings to herself when she thinks no one is listening. The judge was watching Pemberton now with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something more engaged. Your Honor, Pemberton said quietly, I've been practicing family law for 30 years. And in those 30 years, I have learned one thing above all others. You cannot buy love. You cannot litigate it. You cannot manufacture it with financial statements and letters of recommendation. Love is what shows up when everything else fails. And Jack Mercer showed up. The judge called a recess. In the hallway, Jack leaned against the wall with his eyes closed, his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Pemberton stood beside him, quietly flipping through his legal pad. That was the easy part, Pemberton said. This afternoon they'll come after your record. Be ready. The afternoon session began with Blackwell's lawyer calling Jack to the witness stand. The man circled him like a predator, each question designed to draw blood. Mr. Mercer, you served 6 years in Ridgemont Federal Correctional Facility. Is that correct? Yes. For charges including aggravated assault, conspiracy, and weapons possession. Yes. You were a member of a motorcycle gang known as the Iron Wolves, an organization linked to drug trafficking, extortion, and violent crime. I was a member. I left the organization before my incarceration and have had no contact with them since. The lawyer picked up a folder from his table. Let me draw your attention to a specific incident. On March 14th, 12 years ago, you assaulted a young man named Daniel Gallagher outside a bar in Henderson, Nevada. Mr. Gallagher was 18 years old at the time. You broke 3 of his ribs and caused a grade 2 concussion that required hospitalization for 3 weeks. The words landed like hammer blows. Jack gripped the railing of the witness stand. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him from all sides. Is this accurate, Mr. Mercer? Yes, Jack's voice was low but steady. It is. An 18-year-old boy, 3 broken ribs, 3 weeks in the hospital. Yes. And you believe you're fit to care for a vulnerable child. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Jack looked at his hands, the same hands that had broken Danny Gallagher's ribs, the same hands that now helped Emma with her physical therapy exercises every afternoon. The same hands that held paper hearts and turned pages of storybooks and pushed a purple wheelchair through hospital gardens. What I did to Danny Gallagher is the worst thing I've ever done, Jack said. His voice carried through the silent room. I think about it every day. I wrote him letters from prison, every month for 6 years. I sent money when I could. Not because anyone told me to, but because I needed him to know that I understood what I'd taken from him. He paused. I can't undo what I did, but I can choose who I am now. And who I am now is a man who would cut off his own hands before he let them hurt anyone again. The lawyer pressed on, circling back to the weapons charges, the gang affiliations, the years of violence. Each question was a shovel digging up bones that Jack had buried but never forgotten. And Jack answered each one with the same terrible honesty, never deflecting, never minimizing, standing in the full light of his own history and refusing to look away. When the cross-examination ended, the courtroom felt like a place where something had been broken open and left exposed. Judge Calloway called an end to the day's proceedings and scheduled the next hearing for the following week. In the hallway, Pemberton was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You did well in there, Jack. You told the truth, and truth has a weight that no amount of money can outmatch. Did it matter, Mom? It always matters. It doesn't always win, but it always matters." Jack drove to the hospital. It was past visiting hours, but the night nurse, a young woman named Rebecca, who had watched Jack and Emma's relationship develop over months, let him in without a word. He walked down the dark corridor to room 312 and pushed the door open. Emma was asleep. The nightlight cast a soft purple glow across her face, and her stuffed bear was tucked under one arm. Her new wheelchair sat beside the bed, the chrome catching the faint light. Jack pulled the chair to her bedside and sat down. He watched her sleep for a long time, listening to her breathing, watching the small movements of her hands as she dreamed. On the bedside table, a new paper heart lay drying, its glue still slightly tacky. She'd written on this one too, in letters that were getting steadier each week. "My daddy is brave." He picked up the heart and held it in his hands, and the tears came then, silent and unstoppable, falling onto the construction paper and blurring the crayon letters. He cried for the boy he'd hurt. He cried for the years he'd wasted. He cried for the woman on the highway who'd seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself. And he cried for this girl, this impossible, beautiful girl who called him daddy and believed he was brave. The second hearing came faster than Jack expected. Pemberton had spent the intervening days on the phone with his investigator friend, a retired detective named Frank Callahan, who had the kind of tenacity that made people nervous. What Callahan found sent a tremor through the case. "Richard Blackwell," Pemberton said, spreading documents across his office desk. "Real name Richard Bellamy. Changed it legally 8 years ago. Before the name change, he had a series of failed business ventures, 2 bankruptcies, and a civil suit for fraud that was settled out of court." Jack stared at the papers. "He's a con man." "Potentially, but it gets worse." Callahan pulled Blackwell's genealogical records. "He claims to be a cousin of Sarah Whitfield through her mother's side, but the family tree doesn't add up. The records he submitted to the court show a connection through a woman named Dorothy Whitfield Blackwell, supposedly Sarah's aunt. But according to county records, Dorothy Whitfield never married anyone named Blackwell. She married a man named Patterson and moved to Oregon in 1982. He faked the records." "We believe so, but believing and proving are 2 different things, and his lawyers will fight like cornered animals to keep this evidence out." Pemberton looked at Jack over the rim of his glasses. "There's something else. Sarah Whitfield's life insurance policy. $2 million in trust for Emma. As Emma's legal guardian, Blackwell would have significant control over how those funds are dispersed." The picture was clear now, ugly and complete. Richard Blackwell was not Emma's relative. He was a fraud who had manufactured a family connection to gain custody of a child and access to her inheritance. The 6-year-old girl in the purple wheelchair was not a person to him. She was an asset. Jack's hands curled into fists, and for one dangerous moment the old rage rose up like a tide. He wanted to find Blackwell and show him what the iron wolves did to men who preyed on children. He wanted to use his hands the way he'd used them before, efficiently and without mercy. But then he thought of Emma's paper heart. "My daddy is brave." And he unclenched his fists, one finger at a time, and breathed. "How do we prove it?" he asked. "Callahan is tracking down Dorothy Whitfield Patterson in Oregon. If she's still alive, her testimony could blow Blackwell's claim apart. In the meantime, we file a motion to delay the proceedings and submit the genealogical discrepancies to the court. And if the judge doesn't buy it, Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then we need another way. We need something that proves not just who Blackwell isn't, but who you are. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. Jack was asleep on his couch, the parenting book he'd been reading blade open across his chest. He grabbed the phone on the second ring, heart already pounding. It was Clara. Her voice was strained in a way he'd never heard before. Jack, you need to come to the hospital. Now Emma's running a high fever. She's been vomiting for the last hour and her blood pressure is dropping. He was dressed and in his truck in 90 seconds. The streets were empty at this hour, and he drove faster than he should have, running 2 yellow lights and one that might have been red. The hospital parking lot was half empty, and he left the truck at an angle across 2 spaces and ran. The pediatric ward at night was a different place than during the day. The lights were dim, the hallways quiet except for the rhythmic beep of monitors and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes on tile. Jack's boots broke the silence like gunshots as he ran toward the room 312. Clara met him outside the door. Her face told him everything before her words did. She has an infection. Urinary tract probably related to the catheter. It's spreading fast and her temperature is 104. The doctor started antibiotics, but with her immune system already compromised from the spinal condition, it's serious. Jack pushed through the door. Emma lay in her bed smaller than ever against the white sheets, her face flushed red, her dark curls damp with sweat. An IV ran into her arm and the monitor beside her bed displayed numbers that meant nothing to Jack except that they were wrong. He pulled the chair to her bedside and took her hand. It was burning hot. "Daddy," her voice was small, barely a whisper. "I don't feel good." "I know, baby. I'm here. The doctors are going to make you feel better. Promise? Promise, bye." She closed her eyes and her fingers tightened around his. Jack sat there in the dim light, holding his daughter's hand, listening to the beep of the heart monitor, watching the IE drip and making deals with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Clara came in and out throughout the night, checking vitals, adjusting the IV, her face a mask of professional calm that couldn't quite hide the worry underneath. The doctor came at 4 in the morning, a young woman with tired eyes who examined Emma with careful, competent hands and told Jack that the next 12 hours would be critical. He didn't leave her side. Not when morning came and the light crept through the blinds, not when Clara brought him coffee that he didn't drink, not when Mrs. Thompson called about the hearing which was scheduled for that afternoon. The hearing, the custody hearing, was today. Jack looked at Emma asleep now, her breathing shallow but steady, the fever still burning. Then he looked at his phone where Pemberton had left 3 messages about the importance of today's proceedings. He called Pemberton. "I can't come to court today," he said. The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Jack, if you don't appear, the judge could rule in Blackwell's favor by default. Emma's in the hospital. She has a serious infection. I'm not leaving her." Another silence. Then Pemberton's voice quieter now. "I understand. I'll request a continuance. But Jack Blackwell's lawyers will use this. They'll say you're irresponsible, that you can't manage both her medical needs and your legal obligations. Let them say what they want. My daughter is sick. I'm staying." He hung up and took Emma's hand again. Her fever broke at 11 in the morning. She opened her eyes, saw Jack sitting there, unwashed and unshaved and still wearing yesterday's clothes, and she smiled. "You stayed," she whispered. "I'll always stay." And Blackwell's lawyers did use it. At the rescheduled hearing 3 days later, they argued that Jack's failure to appear demonstrated a pattern of irresponsibility and inability to manage the complex demands of caring for a special needs child. They said it with straight faces and expensive ties and the absolute certainty of men who had never sat beside a sick child's bed at 4 in the morning, bargaining with God. Judge Calloway listened with her reading glasses perched on her nose and her expression unreadable. When Blackwell's lawyer finished, she turned to Pemberton. "Does the respondent have anything to say about his absence from the previous hearing?" Pemberton stood slowly. "Your Honor, Mr. Mercer was absent because his daughter had a temperature of 104 degrees and was fighting a serious infection. He was at her bedside for 18 hours straight. He chose his child over his court date." Pemberton let that sit for a moment. We would argue that this is not evidence of irresponsibility. It is evidence of exactly the kind of father Emma Rose needs. The judge made a note on her pad. She didn't smile, but something shifted in her eyes that might have been the beginning of an opinion. The days between hearings became a strange kind of purgatory. Jack went to work at the garage, came home smelling of motor oil and brake fluid, showered, changed, and drove to the hospital. Emma was recovering from the infection, but slowly, and the doctors wanted to keep her under observation for at least another week. "Read me the one about the train," she'd say each evening, her voice still weak, but her spirit undiminished. And Jack would read The Little Engine That Could for the 40th time, doing the voices, making the chugging sounds, watching Emma's eyes grow heavy as the little engine climbed its mountain. He started having nightmares. Not the old kind, the prison kind, where the walls closed in and the locks clicked and the air tasted of concrete and fear. These were new. In these dreams, he was standing in a courtroom and a judge was reading a verdict, but he couldn't hear the words, and Emma was being wheeled away down an infinite corridor by a man in an expensive suit, and she was looking back at him over her shoulder, reaching for him, calling his name, and his feet wouldn't move. He'd wake up sweating, hard hammering, and lie in the dark until his breathing slowed, and then he'd reach for the paper heart on his nightstand and hold it until his hands stopped shaking. Clara noticed the shadows under his eyes. "You're not sleeping," she said one afternoon, not asking. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're exhausted and terrified, and you're trying to hold it all together with sheer stubbornness." She sat down across from him in the hospital cafeteria. "Jack, listen to me. You cannot pour from an empty cup. If you collapse, who takes care of Emma?" "I won't collapse." "That's what they all say, right before they collapse." Clara reached across the table and took both his hands. "Let me help. Let the people who care about you help. You don't have to do this alone." Jack looked at this woman who had become, without either of them fully acknowledging it, the closest thing to a mother he'd ever had. She'd guided him through the bewildering landscape of childcare with patience and humor. She'd answered his midnight phone calls when he couldn't figure out how to handle a bad dream or a missed medication. She'd ironed his shirt for court and told him he looked handsome, and he'd believed her because Clara Brennan didn't say things she didn't mean. "I'm scared, Clara," he said. The words came out like stones, heavy and reluctant. "Not of Blackwell, not of the court. I'm scared of what happens to Emma if I lose." Clara squeezed his hands. "Then don't lose." Pemberton called on a Friday evening with news that made Jack's knees buckle. "Callahan found Dorothy Patterson," the lawyer said. "She's 83 years old, living in a nursing home in Eugene, Oregon. Sharp as a tack, according to Callahan. And she's never heard of Richard Blackwell." Jack sank into his couch. She confirmed it. She confirmed everything. Sarah Whitfield was her niece. Dorothy knows the entire family tree. There is no Richard Blackwell anywhere in it. No Richard Bellamy either. The man is a complete stranger. Can she testify? She's willing. Her health is fragile, but she said, and I quote, "If some con artist is trying to steal my great-niece's baby, you can wheel me into that courtroom on a hospital bed, and I'll tell them exactly what I think of him." Pemberton paused. "I'm filing the motion Monday morning. We're also subpoenaing Blackwell's genealogical records for forensic analysis. If those documents were fabricated, and I believe they were, we'll prove it." Jack closed his eyes. The relief was staggering, almost physical, like putting down a weight he'd been carrying for weeks. But Pemberton wasn't finished. "There's a complication," the lawyer said. "Blackwell knows we're investigating. His lawyers filed a motion this morning asking the court to expedite the custody decision. They want a ruling before we can present our evidence." Can they do that? They can ask. Whether the judge grants it depends on how compelling they make their case. And they're very, very good at being compelling. The weekend stretched out like a desert. Jack spent it at the hospital with Emma, who was feeling better and demanding increasingly ambitious entertainment. They built a tower of blocks that reached Jack's shoulder before it collapsed. They drew pictures of every animal they could think of. They had wheelchair races down the corridor that made the night nurse laugh and the head nurse frown. On Sunday night, after Emma fell asleep, Jack sat in the darkened room and watched the shadows move across the ceiling. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The IV dripped. The nightlight glowed purple. He pulled the photograph from his pocket. Sarah Whitfield on a highway in the desert. her hand on her belly, her eyes squinting against the sun. A stranger in a leather vest bent under the hood of her car. Two people who would never meet again, connected by a moment of ordinary kindness that had somehow become the hinge on which a little girl's life would turn. "I'll take care of her," Jack whispered to the photograph. "I promise." Monday morning, the courtroom. Pemberton was already at the table when Jack arrived, his legal pad full of notes, his face set in an expression of controlled intensity that Jack hadn't seen before. Blackwell's lawyers came out swinging. They had filed an emergency motion to expedite, arguing that the extended proceedings were harmful to Emma's well-being and that a swift resolution in their client's favor would be in the child's best interest. Their lead attorney presented it with the practiced urgency of a man who knew the clock was his enemy. Judge Calloway listened, then turned to Pemberton. "Your Honor," Pemberton said, rising slowly to his feet, "the respondent opposes the motion to expedite. We have recently obtained evidence that directly challenges the petitioner's claimed relationship to the minor child." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Blackwell's lead attorney stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a transparent delay tactic." "It's a fraud allegation," Pemberton said calmly. "We have located the actual family member whose identity appears to have been appropriated in the petitioner's genealogical records. Dorothy Whitfield Patterson of Eugene, Oregon, who is prepared to testify that she has no knowledge of the petitioner and that he does not appear in the Whitfield family tree." The courtroom went very quiet. Blackwell's face didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes, a rapid calculation, a recalibration of odds. Judge Calloway removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked directly at Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "would you like to respond to these allegations?" Blackwell's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in his client's ear. Blackwell whispered back. The lawyer straightened, adjusted his tie, and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we categorically deny any suggestion of fraud, Mr. Blackwell's relationship to the child has been documented and submitted to this court in good faith. We will address these baseless accusations at the appropriate time." "The appropriate time is now," Judge Calloway said. "I'm denying the motion to expedite. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. In the interim, I am ordering an independent verification of the petitioner's genealogical records and granting the respondent's request to depose Dorothy Whitfield Patterson by video conference." Blackwell's lawyers objected. The judge overruled them with a single word and a look that could have cut glass. In the hallway afterward, Pemberton allowed himself a thin smile. "We bought ourselves time, and we rattled them. Did you see Blackwell's face when I mentioned Dorothy Patterson?" "I saw it. He knows we're on to him. The question now is what he does next. A smart man would cut his losses and disappear, but a greedy man doubles down." "Which one is Blackwell?" Pemberton considered this. "In my experience, greed is a more powerful motivator than intelligence. I expect him to fight." Pemberton was right. 2 days later, Jack received a phone call that made his blood run cold. Blackwell's investigators had dug into Jack's past with the thoroughness of men paid by the hour to find dirt, and they had found something that Jack had prayed would stay buried. The call came from Pemberton. "Sit down, Jack." Jack sat. "Blackwell's lawyers are preparing to introduce evidence of your involvement in a weapons trafficking operation in 2008. The Iron Wolves were running guns across the Nevada-California border. You were named as a participant in the FBI's investigation, though charges were ultimately not filed due to insufficient evidence." Jack's stomach dropped. "I drove a truck. Once. I didn't know what was in the back until we were stopped at a checkpoint and Hank Rollins told me to stay calm. When I found out what they were moving, I walked away from the club." "I believe you, but the court record shows the investigation and Blackwell's lawyers will paint it in the worst possible light. Ex-con with gang ties involved in weapons trafficking seeks custody of a disabled child. That's their narrative. It's not the truth. In a courtroom, truth and narrative are two different things. Our job is to make sure the judge sees the truth." Jack hung up and stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot below. His reflection stared back at him from the glass superimposed on the gray concrete and the bare trees. He looked at himself the way a judge would look at him, the tattoos, the scars, the history written on his body and in his record. For one terrible clarifying moment, he considered giving up, walking away, letting Blackwell have her. Because what if the lawyers were right? What if his past was too heavy, Too dark, too deeply embedded in who he was to ever fully escape. What if loving Emma wasn't enough to outweigh everything he'd done? His phone buzzed, a text from Clara. She'd attached a photo. Emma sitting up in her hospital bed holding a new paper heart. This one said, "Daddy comes soon." Jack stared at the photo until his vision blurred. Then he wiped his eyes, picked up his phone, and called Pemberton back. "What do we need to do?" "We need a witness. Someone who can speak to your character not from the present, but from the past. Someone who can testify that your transformation is real, that the man you are today is not the man you were." Jack was quiet for a long time. Then he said a name he hadn't spoken in over a decade. "Danny Gallagher." The silence on the line was deafening. "The boy you assaulted." Pemberton's voice was careful. "He's not a boy anymore. He'd be 28 now." Jack took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "I wrote him letters from prison. Every month for 6 years. I sent money when I could. He never wrote back. Not once. And you want to ask him to testify on your behalf?" "I want to ask him to tell the truth. Whatever that truth is. If he stands up in court and says I'm a monster, then at least Emma will know I didn't hide from it. And if he says something else," Jack paused, "then maybe the judge will see what Emma sees." Pemberton was quiet for a long time. "I'll find him," he said finally. "But Jack, you need to be prepared for the possibility that Danny Gallagher has not forgiven you, that he carries what you did to him every single day, that seeing your face in a courtroom might be the last thing he wants." "I know," Jack said, "but I owe him the chance to say whatever he needs to say. I've owed him that for 12 years. He hung up and went to the hospital. Emma was awake, sitting up in bed, her color better than it had been in days. She was cutting paper hearts, her tongue poking out in concentration, her scissors moving with the careful precision of a 6-year-old who takes her art very seriously. "Daddy," she said when he walked in. And the word was a door opening. The word was a hand reaching. The word was proof that in a world full of broken things, some things could still be made whole. He sat beside her and picked up a pair of scissors and a piece of construction paper. Together in the quiet afternoon light, a convicted felon and a girl in a wheelchair made paper hearts for strangers, and the world outside the window went on without them, indifferent and enormous, while inside that small room, something precious and improbable continued to grow. That evening, after Emma fell asleep, Jack walked out to the hospital garden alone. The benches were empty at this hour. The fountain had been turned off for the night, and the surface of the small pond was black and still reflecting the sodium orange glow of the parking lot lights. He sat on the bench where he and Emma always stopped to feed the ducks and stretched his legs out in front of him. His body ached from too little sleep and too much worry, but the ache felt different now than it used to. In the old days, his body had ached from fights, from the blunt physical costs of violence. Now it ached from bending over a hospital bed, from kneeling on hard floors to play with toy cars, from carrying a 40-pound girl who wrapped her arms around his neck and called him daddy. Better aches, the best aches he'd ever had. His phone buzzed, a text from Pemberton. 2 words: found him. Jack stared at the screen. Found him. Danny Gallagher. The 18-year-old kid he'd beaten in a bar parking lot 12 years ago. The kid whose ribs he'd broken, whose head he'd slammed against concrete, whose blood he'd washed off his knuckles in a gas station bathroom while feeling nothing, absolutely nothing, because the drugs and the rage and the nihilistic momentum of his life with the Iron Wolves had turned him into something that operated on fury and reflex and never stopped to count the cost. Danny Gallagher would be 28 now. A man who had spent 12 years carrying the weight of what Jack Mercer had done to him. Jack typed back, where Pemberton's reply came quickly. Denver. He's a high school wrestling coach, married 1 kid. Callahan talked to him this afternoon. He agreed to a phone call. Tomorrow at 10. Jack set his phone down and looked at the dark water of the pond. Somewhere beneath the surface, the ducks were sleeping, tucked into whatever private places ducks go when the breadcrumbs stop and the people leave. Tomorrow at 10, he would hear Danny Gallagher's voice for the first time in 12 years, and he would ask the man he'd nearly killed to help him keep the only thing that had ever made his life worth living. The irony was not lost on him. It sat beside him on the bench like a companion, silent, impatient, and full of sharp edges. He went home. He didn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote him a letter. Not to Danny. He'd written enough letters to Danny over the years. This one was to Emma. He didn't know why he felt compelled to write it, except that some part of him understood that tomorrow could change everything, and he wanted there to be a record, something she could hold in her hands if the worst happened. Dear Emma, he wrote, and then sat for a long time with the pen hovering over the paper because everything he wanted to say was too big for words. I don't know how to be a father. I never had one, not really, and the men I chose to follow instead of a father taught me things that took years to unlearn. But here's what I do know. I know that you changed my life, not slowly, not gradually, not the way people usually change. You changed me the way the sun changes the sky in the morning. All at once, everywhere, completely. I know that you are the bravest person I've ever met, and I've met some people who thought they were brave because they weren't afraid of anything. But you taught me that real bravery is being afraid and choosing love anyway. You were afraid in those foster homes. You were afraid when your mother was sick. You were afraid every time someone left. And you kept choosing love. You kept making paper hearts. You kept believing. If I don't win this fight, I need you to know that it's not because I didn't try. And I need you to know that whatever happens, you were right about me. I am the man your mother told you about. I'm the one who stopped on the highway. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the faith you put in me that first day in the hospital when you put your arms around my neck and called me daddy. I love you, Emma Rose, more than motorcycles, more than freedom, more than the open road and the wind and every wild, reckless thing I ever loved before you came along and showed me what love actually looks like. Your daddy, Jack. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer beside his bed. Then he lay down in the dark and waited for morning and for the phone call that would either save him or end him, and for the voice of a man he'd broken who might, if grace existed, be willing to help put him back together. At 9:55 the next morning, Jack sat at his kitchen table with his phone in front of him, staring at Danny Gallagher's number. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. The old Jack would have been pacing, slamming things, flooding his bloodstream with adrenaline. The new Jack sat still and felt everything. At 10 o'clock exactly, he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times. 4, 5. Jack's grip tightened. Then a click, a breath, and a voice he would have recognized anywhere, even after 12 years, even in a crowd, even in a dream. This is Danny. Jack closed his eyes. Danny, this is Jack Mercer. The silence that followed was the longest silence of Jack's life. He could hear Danny breathing slow and measured the breathing of someone who has trained himself to stay calm under pressure. A wrestling coach's breathing. I know who you are, Danny said. Your lawyer's guy already called me. I know, I wanted to call myself. I owed you that. Another silence. Then Danny said something that Jack didn't expect. I read your letters. Jack opened his eyes. You read them? Everyone, 72 letters over 6 years. I kept them in a shoebox in my closet. My wife found them last year and asked me about them, and I told her the whole story. Danny, I am so sorry for what I did to you, for the boy you were and the pain I caused. I am sorry every single day. I know you are. Danny's voice was quiet but firm. I knew it from the 3rd letter. Most people who write apology letters from prison stop after 2 or 3. You wrote 72, and every one of them was different. You weren't just saying sorry, you were becoming sorry. I could hear it happening letter by letter. Jack pressed his palm against his eyes. The kitchen blurred, the morning light blurred, everything blurred except Danny's voice coming through the phone like a signal from another world. Your lawyer's investigator told me about the little girl, Danny said. Emma. She's everything, Danny. She's the reason I'm calling, not for me, for her. I know. There was a pause, and when Danny spoke again, his voice had changed, softened into something that sounded like a decision being made. I'll come. I'll testify. The words hit Jack like an impact. He gripped the edge of the table. But I'm not doing it for you, Danny continued. I'm doing it because 12 years ago, you broke my ribs. And then you spent 6 years writing me letters and sending money you probably couldn't afford and trying to become someone different. And if that little girl sees something good in you, then maybe the man who hurt me really is gone. And if he's gone, then maybe the best thing his ghost can do is help build something instead of breaking it. Jack couldn't speak. His throat had sealed shut, and the tears were coming now silent and relentless, falling onto the kitchen table in small dark spots. I'll be there next week, Danny said. Tell your lawyer to send me the details. The line went dead. Jack sat at his kitchen table in the morning light, holding a phone that had just delivered a grace he did not deserve and could never repay. And he wept. He wept for the boy Danny had been. He wept for the man Danny had become. He wept for Emma and for Sarah and for Clara and for himself and for the strange, impossible, unearnable mercy of being given another chance by someone who had every right to refuse. The final hearing fell on a Tuesday in late October. The trees along the courthouse steps had turned the color of fire, and a cold wind sent leaves skittering across the pavement like small, restless ghosts. Jack arrived an hour early wearing the same borrowed suit freshly pressed by Clara, who had also trimmed his beard and made him eat breakfast even though his stomach felt like it was filled with wet cement. Pemberton was already inside arranging papers at their table, with the methodical calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times and understood that preparation was the only antidote to fear. He looked up when Jack sat down and gave a single nod that conveyed everything words couldn't. "We're ready. Whatever happens, we're ready." The courtroom filled slowly. Mrs. Thompson from Social Services took her seat in the second row, her clipboard balanced on her knee. Two nurses from the hospital, Sarah and Rebecca, sat behind Jack, their presence a quiet declaration of allegiance. Clara arrived with Emma pushing the purple wheelchair down the center aisle with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated every kind of terrain. Emma wore a blue dress that matched her eyes and a ribbon in her dark curls that Clara had tied that morning, with hands that trembled slightly with age and emotion. "Daddy," Emma said when she saw Jack, and the word rang through the courtroom like a bell, clear and bright and impossible to ignore. She wheeled herself to him, and he knelt down, and she put her hands on either side of his face the way she always did, framing him, holding him, making sure he was really there. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little bit," he admitted. "That's okay, I'm brave enough for both of us." Jack kissed her forehead and straightened up. Across the aisle, Blackwell's legal team was assembling. 3 lawyers, a paralegal, folders and laptops, and the quiet machinery of money applied to the law. Blackwell himself sat behind them, but something had changed. The polished confidence was still there, but it was thinner now, a veneer applied over something that looked, if you studied it closely, like worry. Judge Calloway entered. The bailiff called the court to order, and the fight for Emma Rose Whitfield began its final round. Pemberton opened by requesting permission to present new evidence. Blackwell's lead attorney objected, immediately arguing that the evidence was obtained improperly, that it was irrelevant, that it was a last-minute attempt to derail proceedings. The judge overruled each objection with the controlled patience of someone who has heard every variation of legal maneuvering and is no longer entertained by any of them. "Proceed, Mr. Pemberton." The old lawyer stood and addressed the court with the quiet authority of a man who knows that the most powerful weapon in a courtroom is the truth. "Your Honor, over the past 2 weeks, we have conducted an independent investigation into the petitioner's claimed familial relationship with the minor child, Emma Rose Whitfield. What we found is deeply troubling." He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The genealogical records Blackwell had submitted, which showed a family connection through Dorothy Whitfield Blackwell. The fact that no such person existed. The real Dorothy Whitfield, who had married a man named Patterson in 1982 and was currently living in a nursing home in Eugene, Oregon. Dorothy's sworn deposition taken by video conference 3 days ago, in which the 83-year-old woman stated clearly and firmly that she had never heard of Richard Blackwell, that he was not a member of her family, and that the documents bearing her name were fabrications. Furthermore, Pemberton continued, "Our investigation has revealed that the petitioner's legal name is not Richard Blackwell. It is Richard Bellamy. He changed his name 8 years ago, shortly after settling a civil fraud suit out of court. He has a history of financial deception, including 2 personal bankruptcies and a business that was investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for investor fraud." The courtroom had gone very still. Blackwell's lawyers were huddled in urgent whispered conference. Blackwell himself sat motionless, his face a mask, but his hands folded on the table in front of him had gone white at the knuckles. "And finally, Your Honor," Pemberton said, "we believe there is a financial motive behind the petitioner's custody claim. Emma Rose Whitfield is the sole beneficiary of a life insurance trust valued at approximately $2 million, established by her late mother, Sarah Whitfield. As Emma's legal guardian, the petitioner would gain significant control over these funds." Judge Calloway turned to Blackwell's attorney. "Does the petitioner wish to respond?" The lead attorney stood. He was smooth, practiced, expensive, but for the first time since the proceedings began, he looked uncertain. Your Honor, we categorically deny these allegations. Mr. Blackwell's relationship to the child is genuine, and any discrepancies in the records are the result of clerical errors, not deliberate falsification. We request time to prepare a formal response. You've had time, the judge said. This hearing is for final arguments. If you have evidence to counter these claims, present it now. The attorney looked back at Blackwell, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The attorney turned back to the judge. We have no additional evidence to present at this time, Your Honor. The words hung in the air like a confession. Judge Calloway made a note on her pad, then looked up. Mr. Pemberton, does the respondent have any additional witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. The respondent calls Daniel Gallagher. A murmur went through the courtroom. Jack turned to look at the gallery and saw Danny Gallagher stand up from the back row. He was taller than Jack remembered, lean and athletic, with the kind of quiet composure that comes from years of teaching young people to channel their strength. He wore a simple gray suit and no tie, and he walked to the witness stand with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who has made peace with where he's going. Jack hadn't seen Danny since the night he'd beaten him in that parking lot. The boy he remembered, 18, scared, bleeding on the concrete, was gone. In his place was a man who looked whole, who looked healed, who looked like someone who had taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and turned it into fuel for a different kind of life. Danny took the oath and sat down. Pemberton approached the stand. Mr. Gallagher, could you please tell the court how you know the respondent, Jack Mercer? Danny looked at Jack. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and something passed between them that was too complicated for a single word. History, pain, the slow grinding work of forgiveness. 12 years ago, Danny said, his voice clear and steady, Jack Mercer assaulted me outside a bar in Henderson, Nevada. He broke 3 of my ribs and gave me a concussion. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The courtroom was silent. Judge Calloway watched Danny with an expression of focused attention. It was the worst night of my life, Danny continued. I was 18. I thought I was going to die on that concrete. For years afterward, I had nightmares. I couldn't be in a room with a large man without my heart rate going through the roof. I dropped out of college. I drank too much. I was angry all the time. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less steady. Then the letters started coming. From prison. 1 a month like clockwork. The first few I threw away without reading. But they kept coming, and eventually I opened one. Danny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases. This is the 14th letter Jack Mercer wrote me. I've carried it in my wallet for 9 years. He unfolded it carefully. It says, Dear Danny, I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me either. But I want you to know that I think about what I did to you every single day. Not because I'm looking for sympathy, but because remembering is the only honest thing I can do. You deserve better than what I gave you. The world deserved better than what I was. I'm trying to be different. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'm trying. Danny refolded the letter and put it back in his pocket. He wrote 72 of those, and he sent money. Not a lot, but regularly, from a prison account that probably didn't have much in it. Pemberton asked, Mr. Gallagher, why did you agree to testify today? Danny looked at Jack again. Because I'm a wrestling coach. I work with kids every day. I teach them that strength isn't about hurting people. It's about discipline, about getting back up when you fall, about being better today than you were yesterday. He paused. Jack Mercer broke my ribs. That's a fact. But he also wrote me 72 letters and spent 6 years trying to become someone different. That's also a fact. And if there's a little girl out there who sees something good in him, who calls him daddy, who believes he's the man his letters say he's trying to be, then I think she deserves the chance to be right. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, Bishop, I was the victim of Jack Mercer's violence. I carry the scars. And I'm standing here today telling you that people can change. Not because they're forced to, not because the court orders it, but because something inside them breaks open and lets the light in. I believe Jack Mercer has changed. And I believe that little girl is the reason. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after Danny finished. Judge Calloway made notes on her pad, her pen moving in careful, deliberate strokes. Jack sat at the table with tears running down his face, making no attempt to wipe them away because hiding was something the old Jack did, and the old Jack was gone. Pemberton's final witness was Clara Brennan. The elderly nurse took the stand with the dignity of a woman who had spent 40 years caring for other people's children and knew more about love than most courtrooms would ever understand. "Miss Brennan," Pemberton said, "how long have you known Jack Mercer?" "5 months, since the day he first walked into Emma's hospital room, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth." "And what have you observed about his relationship with Emma?" Clara folded her hands in her lap. "I've watched a lot of people come through that hospital. Parents, foster families, social workers. Some of them care. Most of them try. But I have never, in 40 years of nursing, seen anyone love a child the way Jack Mercer loves Emma Rose." She looked at Jack and her eyes were bright with tears she was too proud to let fall. He learned her physical therapy routine in a week. He sold his motorcycle, the last thing connecting him to his old life, to buy her a wheelchair. He sits with her through thunderstorms because she's afraid. He reads her stories with different voices for every character. He makes her laugh every single day. Clara's voice grew stronger, but that's not what convinces me. What convinces me is the way Emma is with him. I've known that child since she was 4 years old. I was there when her mother died. I watched her go through 4 foster homes, each one breaking her heart a little more. And in all that time, I never saw her truly happy. Not until Jack. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm 71 years old. I've seen a lot of love in my life, and I've seen a lot of what pretends to be love, but isn't. What Jack and Emma have is the real thing. The messy, imperfect, beautiful, stubborn, real thing. And that little girl deserves to keep it." The judge called for final statements. Blackwell's attorney, looking diminished and off balance, offered a brief argument about blood ties and financial resources that sounded hollow in the wake of everything the courtroom had heard. He did not mention the genealogical records. He did not mention Dorothy Patterson. He did not mention the trust fund. The omissions were louder than anything he said. Then it was Pemberton's turn. The old lawyer stood slowly buttoning his jacket and walked to the center of the courtroom, with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows that the strongest arguments don't need to be rushed. "Your Honor, this case began as a custody dispute, a question of who should care for a parentless child. But it has become something else. It has become a story about what family means." He gestured toward Blackwell. "The petitioner came to this court with money lawyers and a claim of blood relation that we have demonstrated to be fraudulent. He came seeking custody of a child he had never met, driven not by love but by the prospect of controlling a $2 million trust fund." He turned to Jack. "The respondent came to this court with nothing but a criminal record, a borrowed suit, and the unwavering love of a 6-year-old girl who chose him. Not because he was wealthy, not because he was related to her by blood, but because she saw in him something that the rest of the world couldn't see. She saw a father." Pemberton walked to where Emma sat in her wheelchair, and he knelt down slowly and with the careful movements of an old man's joints, so that he was at her level. "Emma," he said gently, "is there anything you'd like to say to the judge?" The courtroom held its breath. Jack's heart stopped. Clara gripped the armrest of her seat. Even Blackwell's lawyers looked up from their papers. Emma looked at Pemberton, then at Judge Calloway, then at Jack. She wheeled herself forward, past the lawyers' tables, past the gallery, until she was in the open space before the bench, a small girl in a blue dress and a purple wheelchair, looking up at a woman in a black robe who held her future in her hands. "Can I talk?" Emma asked the judge. Judge Calloway leaned forward. "You may, sweetheart?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her small hands folded in her lap the way she'd seen the adults do. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried to every corner of the room. "My mommy told me that my daddy would come find me. She said he was big and strong, and he would be scary on the outside, but gentle on the inside like a bear. And then Jack came, and he wasn't scared of my wheelchair. He didn't look at my wheelchair first. He looked at me first." She glanced at Blackwell, then back at the judge. "That man came to see me at the hospital. He brought me an expensive doll, but he kept looking at my wheelchair. He looked at my wheelchair before he looked at me." The courtroom was absolutely still. Not a cough, not a rustle, not a breath. "My daddy makes funny voices when he reads stories," Emma continued, and he helps me with my exercises and never gets mad when I can't do them right. And he bought me a purple wheelchair because purple is my favorite color, and he always knows what I'm thinking, and when there's a thunderstorm, he stays with me until it stops." Her chin lifted, and in that moment, she looked ancient and young, at the same time a child carrying wisdom that most adults never find. "My mommy was right," Emma said. "He came, and I don't want anyone else. I just want my daddy." The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed something that none of them would ever forget. Judge Calloway removed her glasses and pressed the bridge of her nose. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Thank you, Emma," she said quietly. "You may go back to your seat." Clara helped Emma wheel back to Jack's side. Jack reached down and took his daughter's hand, and she squeezed his fingers, and he squeezed back, and neither of them let go. Judge Calloway straightened the papers in front of her. She put her glasses back on. She looked at Blackwell's table, then at Jack's table, then at Emma. "This court has heard extensive testimony over the course of these proceedings," she began. "We have considered financial resources, living situations, criminal records, and family connections. We have also heard evidence that the petitioner's claimed familial relationship to the child is fraudulent, and that his motives for seeking custody may be financial rather than paternal." She paused. "But more importantly, we have heard from the people who know Emma Rose Whitfield best, her nurses, her caregivers, and most compellingly from Emma herself." The judge folded her hands. "In matters of child custody, this court is guided by one principle, above all others, the best interest of the child. And after careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented, it is the finding of this court that the best interest of Emma Rose Whitfield is served by granting full legal custody to Jack Mercer." The words landed like sunlight after a long night. Jack sat motionless for one heartbeat, two heartbeats, three, and then Emma's voice broke through the ringing in his ears. "Daddy, Daddy, you won." And Jack Mercer, 58 years old, 6'4", covered in tattoos and scars, and the evidence of every wrong turn a life can take, bent down and picked up his daughter, and held her against his chest and wept. The judge continued, speaking something about the petitioner's records being referred for criminal investigation, something about a follow-up review in 6 months, something about the appointment of a guardian ad litem. But Jack heard none of it. He heard only Emma whispering against his shoulder the same words she'd said the first day they met. "I knew you'd come." Clara reached them first. She wrapped her arms around both of them, her small frame somehow encompassing Jack's massive one, and she cried without shame or restraint, the way people cry when something they've hoped for actually happens. Danny Gallagher stood in the aisle watching. Jack looked at him over Clara's shoulder, and Danny nodded once, a single definitive nod that contained 12 years of pain and 72 letters and the long unfinished work of forgiveness. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom back to Denver, back to his wrestlers, back to the life he'd built from the wreckage of what Jack had done to him. Pemberton shook Jack's hand with both of his. The old lawyer's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. Take care of that girl." "I will. Thank you, Harold, for everything." Blackwell and his lawyers left quickly, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with the sound of retreat. Jack watched them go and felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication, just the weight of his daughter in his arms and the knowledge that the fight was over and love had won. The autumn sun was warm on their faces as they left the courthouse. Jack carried Emma down the steps while Clara followed with the wheelchair, and the three of them stood on the sidewalk while the world went about its business around them. Cars and pedestrians and the ordinary machinery of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that had become for them the most extraordinary day of their lives. "Can we get ice cream?" Emma asked. Jack laughed. It was the first real laugh he'd produced in weeks, full-bodied and unrestrained, rising from somewhere deep in his chest. "Yeah, kiddo, we can get ice cream." They drove to a small shop on Maple Street, the kind with a bell above the door and hand-painted flavors on a chalkboard behind the counter. Jack ordered chocolate for Emma, vanilla for himself, and butter pecan for Clara, who declared it the best ice cream she'd had in 30 years, though she said that about every ice cream she'd ever eaten. They sat in a booth by the window, the afternoon light falling across the table in warm stripes. Emma ate her cone with methodical precision, licking in careful circles to prevent drips, a technique she'd perfected over dozens of post-hospital ice cream trips with Jack. "Daddy," she said between licks, "now that we're a real family, can we get a dog?" Clara laughed. Jack pretended to think about it, stroking his beard the way he always did when Emma asked for something he was going to say yes to, but wanted to draw out the suspense. "We'll see," he said, which meant yes, and Emma knew it, and she grinned at Clara, who grinned back, and the three of them sat in the warm light eating ice cream, while the leaves fell outside and the world turned, and everything for once was exactly as it should be. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Jack's life, in the fullest. He brought Emma home from the hospital on a Saturday morning, carrying her up the wheelchair ramp he'd built, while Clara followed with bags of Emma's belongings. Her room was ready. He'd painted it purple, her favorite color, and hung butterfly stickers on the walls, and installed shelves at wheelchair height so she could reach her books and art supplies. Emma explored every inch of the apartment with the intensity of a cartographer mapping new territory. She approved of the ramp. She approved of her room. She approved of the kitchen where Jack had stocked her favorite foods, carrots and chocolate milk, and the specific brand of peanut butter that she insisted was the only acceptable kind. She approved of the view from the window, which looked out over a parking lot and a strip of grass, and beyond that, a park with a pond where ducks gathered in the mornings. "I can see the ducks from here," she announced. "Can we feed them tomorrow?" "Every morning if you want." They developed routines. Mornings began with breakfast, during which Emma narrated her plans for the day with the confidence of a corporate executive running a board meeting. Then Jack would help her with her exercises, the stretches and strengthening movements that Clara had taught him, counting out loud together, while the morning light moved across the floor. He drove her to school, where she was enrolled in a first-grade class with a teacher named Mrs. Holloway, who had 23 years of experience and a voice like warm honey. Emma made friends quickly, the way children do when they have the kind of openness that hasn't been beaten out of them by the world. She came home with stories about a boy named Marcus who could name every dinosaur, and a girl named Lily who shared her snacks at lunch. Afternoons were for homework and coloring and wheelchair races down the hallway, which the downstairs neighbor tolerated with the patience of a man who had been told the backstory and decided that some noise was worth enduring. Clara came by 3 times a week. She'd arrive with a casserole or a bag of groceries or a new book for Emma, and she'd sit in the kitchen while Jack cooked dinner, offering advice on everything from laundry techniques to bedtime strategies. Her wisdom dispensed with the casual authority of a woman who had raised generations of children, none of them biologically hers, all of them permanently in her heart. On Sundays, they went to the park. Jack would push Emma's wheelchair along the paths while she pointed out birds and flowers and clouds that looked like animals. They fed the ducks. They watched squirrels argue over territory. They sat on the bench by the pond and ate sandwiches that Jack had cut into triangles with the crusts removed, just the way Emma liked them. One Sunday, as the autumn light turned everything gold, Emma reached over and took Jack's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his large ones, finding the spaces between his scarred knuckles, like they were made to fit there. "Daddy." "Yeah, princess. I'm really glad you stopped to fix Mommy's car that day." Jack looked at his daughter. The sunlight caught her dark curls and the freckles on her nose and the brightness of her eyes that had survived foster homes and hospitals, and the loss of the only person who had ever loved her, until a stranger walked into her room and knelt down and let her hold on. "Me too," Emma rose. "Me too." The first real test came on a Thursday evening in December. Jack was washing dishes when a knock came at the door, heavy and familiar, in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He dried his hands on a towel, checked that Emma was absorbed in her coloring book at the kitchen table, and opened the door. 2 men stood in the hallway. They wore leather vests, and the patches on their chests were ones Jack knew as intimately as his own scars. Iron wolves. The taller one was Ricky Sloan, who Jack had once called a brother. The shorter one was a kid Jack didn't recognize, young, maybe 22, with the kind of restless eyes that come from too much adrenaline and not enough direction. Bear. Ricky's voice was a low rasp, roughened by years of cigarettes and shouted arguments. Long time. Jack stepped into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed behind him, leaving just a crack, just enough to hear Emma if she called. "What are you doing here, Ricky?" "Heard about your situation." "The kid, the court thing, all of it." Ricky leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Some of the boys were wondering if you might need help. The kind of help we used to be good at. The implication was clear. Jack looked at Ricky, at the young man beside him, at the vests with their stitched insignias, and he felt the pull. Not toward the violence, not anymore, but toward the belonging, the brotherhood, the seductive simplicity of a world where problems were solved with force and loyalty was the only currency that mattered. The court case is done, Jack said. I won custody. Yeah, we heard that too. But that rich guy Blackwell or whatever. Word is he's not happy. Word is he might try something else. If he does, I'll handle it through the law. Ricky snorted. Through the law. Listen to you, the bear going legit. He shook his head slowly. You know we had your back for 15 years. You were family. I have a family now, Ricky, a real one. The words landed between them like a line drawn in concrete. Ricky stared at Jack for a long moment, his expression cycling through something complex, hurt maybe, or recognition, or the particular sadness of watching someone you knew become someone you don't. Daddy, Emma's voice floated through the crack in the door. Who are you talking to? Jack didn't look away from Ricky. Nobody, sweetheart. I'll be right there. Ricky glanced at the door and something in his face changed. The hardness softened for just a moment, just long enough for Jack to see the man underneath the leather and the patches and the years of bad choices. Take care of yourself, Bear. You too, Ricky. The two iron wolves turned and walked down the hallway, their boots echoing on the stairs. Jack stood in the doorway until the sound faded, then went inside and closed the door and locked it, and sat down next to Emma and picked up a crayon and colored with her until bedtime, his hand steady, his heart sure. Christmas morning was chaos. Emma woke at 5:30, which meant Jack woke at 5:30, which meant Clara, who had spent the night on the couch, woke at 5:30. The small apartment was decorated with a tree that listed slightly to the left and lights that Jack had strung around the windows with more enthusiasm than skill. Presents were piled under the tree, most of them wrapped in paper that Emma had decorated herself with stamps and stickers and liberal applications of glitter. Emma opened each gift with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the anticipation was part of the joy. A new set of art supplies, a book about butterflies, a stuffed bear that was almost as big as she was. And from Clara, a handmade quilt, each square cut from a different fabric, stitched together with the patience of someone who had spent 40 years learning that the things made by hand carry something that factory-made things never can. Jack's gift to Emma was a framed photograph. Not a new one, but the old one, the faded picture of a pregnant woman and a stranger on a highway. He'd had it professionally cleaned and mounted, and beneath it, in simple script, he'd had the framer add the words Sarah Whitfield had written on the back. The kind man on Route 191. Emma held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She traced her mother's face with one small finger. That's Mommy, she said softly. That's Mommy, and that's me. Emma looked up at Jack with eyes that were ancient and young, full of understanding that went deeper than language. She knew, Emma whispered. She knew you were my daddy before either of us did. Jack nodded. His throat was too tight for words. Emma placed the photograph on her nightstand next to the lamp with the purple shade where it would be the last thing she saw before she fell asleep, and the first thing she saw when she woke up. Her mother and her father together on a highway in the desert years before either of them knew what they would become to a little girl who wasn't born yet. Clara cooked breakfast, pancakes the kind with blueberries that Emma loved, and bacon, and orange juice and coffee for the adults that was strong enough to wake the dead. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window and touched everything with gold, and the apartment that had once been too empty and too quiet was full, gloriously full of the sounds and smells and presence of a family. After breakfast, they called Clara's sister on the phone so Emma could wish her a Merry Christmas. They watched a movie about a reindeer with a red nose. Jack helped Emma write thank you notes for each gift, her handwriting getting steadier with every card. In the afternoon, it snowed. Fat, heavy flakes that drifted past the window like feathers from a torn pillow. Emma pressed her face against the glass and watched them fall, her breath making small clouds of fog on the cold pane. Can we go outside? Jack bundled her in a coat and scarf and hat and gloves, tucked a blanket around her legs in the wheelchair, and pushed her out into the white world. The snow fell on her eyelashes and her dark curls and the chrome of her wheelchair, and she caught flakes on her tongue and laughed with the pure, unconditional joy of a child experiencing something beautiful for the first time. They made a snowman in the small patch of yard behind the building. Jack did the heavy lifting, rolling the body and the head, while Emma directed operations from her wheelchair with the authority of a general commanding troops. Clara contributed a carrot nose and 2 buttons for eyes that she produced from her purse with the casual preparedness of a woman who was always ready for anything. The snowman was lopsided, its stick arms were uneven, its button eyes gave it a slightly startled expression. It was Emma declared perfect. That night, after Emma was asleep, her new stuffed bear, tucked under one arm, and the butterfly book on her nightstand beside her mother's photograph, Jack stood in the doorway of her room and watched her breathe. The purple nightlight cast soft shadows across her face, and the snow outside the window made everything quiet, the whole world holding its breath. Clara appeared beside him. She handed him a cup of tea and stood with him in the doorway, 2 people watching a sleeping child saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. "You know," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I first saw you walk into that hospital, I thought you were the most unlikely father I'd ever seen." "You were probably right." "I was wrong," Clara smiled. "You were the most unlikely father I'd ever seen. And the best." Jack sipped his tea and looked at his daughter, and the snow fell, and the night was deep and cold and quiet. And inside the small apartment above the garage, everything was warm. The community center event came 6 months later, on a warm evening in April, when the dogwood trees along Main Street were blooming white and pink. The banner above the entrance read, "Community Hero Awards Night," and the parking lot was full, and inside the room buzzed with the comfortable energy of a small town gathering to celebrate its own. Jack wore a tie. This fact alone would have been unthinkable a year ago, and he spent 10 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror trying to get the knot right while Emma coached him from her wheelchair with the exasperated patience of a 6-year-old who had watched approximately 4,000 YouTube tutorials on the subject. "The skinny part goes behind the fat part," she instructed. "No the other way, no behind." Clara arrived wearing a blue dress and a string of pearls that she said were costume jewelry, but that Jack suspected were real. She looked at the 2 of them, the enormous man with the crooked tie and the small girl in the purple dress, as adjusting it for him. And her eyes filled with the particular kind of tears that come from witnessing something you've waited a lifetime to see. At the ceremony, the mayor gave a speech about second chances and the meaning of family. Jack sat with Emma on one side and Clara on the other, and when his name was called, Emma clapped so hard and so fast that the sound was like a small, joyful thunderstorm. He walked to the podium, this man who had once been afraid of everything, soft, and he looked out at the faces watching him. Some of these people had crossed the street to avoid him. Some had locked their car doors when he walked by. Some had looked at his tattoos and his scars and seen only danger. Now they were applauding. Emma spoke first because she had insisted on it, and because no one in the history of the world had ever been able to say no to Emma Rose Whitfield. "My daddy is the best daddy in the whole world," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying with the absolute conviction of someone who has never had a reason to doubt what she believes. "He makes me laugh, and he helps me be brave, and he gives the best bear hugs in the universe. And he stopped on the highway for my mommy a long time ago, and my mommy was right about him because he's the kindest, strongest, most gentle man I ever met." The audience was not dry-eyed. Jack stepped to the microphone. He looked at Emma, then at Clara, then at the room full of people who had become slowly and without fanfare his community. "A year ago," he said, "I was a man with a past and nothing else. No future, no purpose, no reason to get up in the morning except habit." He paused. "Then a 6-year-old girl in a wheelchair hugged me and called me daddy, and everything changed." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had hurt and healed broken and built destroyed and finally held on. "Emma didn't see my tattoos. She didn't see my record. She didn't see the worst things I've done. She saw the best thing I could be. And she believed in it so hard that I had no choice but to start believing it too." He looked at his daughter one more time, and she looked back at him with those eyes that had never learned to doubt, that had survived everything the world could throw at a 6-year-old girl and had come out the other side still full of light. I used to think that love was something you had to earn, Jack said, that you had to be worthy of it. Emma taught me that love isn't something you earn, it's something you receive. And the bravest thing you can do is let it in. The applause followed them out into the spring evening, where the dogwood petals drifted down like small white promises, and the air smelled of cut grass and possibility. Jack pushed Emma's wheelchair along the sidewalk while Clara walked beside them, and the streetlights came on one by one, lighting their way home. "Daddy," Emma said. "Yeah, princess. Can we get a dog tomorrow?" Jack laughed. The sound rose into the evening sky, free and full, and unafraid, the laugh of a man who had found at the end of a long and broken road exactly where he was supposed to be. "Yeah," Emma rose, he said. "Tomorrow we get a dog." And they did. A three-legged rescue mutt named Captain Brown and White, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down, who took one look at Emma in her wheelchair and climbed into her lap like he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly this girl. Emma named him on the spot, and Captain licked her face until she was breathless with laughter, and Jack stood in the shelter doorway, watching his daughter hold a dog who was as imperfect and resilient and full of stubborn joy as she was, and he thought, this is what it looks like when broken things find each other and become whole. They walked home through the spring evening, Captain trotting beside Emma's wheelchair on his three legs, keeping pace with a determination that seemed to say, "I may be missing a piece, but I'm not missing a step." Emma talked to him the entire way, explaining the route, introducing him to the neighborhood, pointing out the park where they would go every morning. "And that's where the ducks live," she told Captain seriously. "You're not allowed to chase them. They're our friends." Captain wagged his tail in what might have been agreement. At home, the three-legged dog explored the apartment with the same meticulous attention Emma had shown on her first day. He sniffed every corner, every piece of furniture, every shoe. He inspected Emma's room and apparently approved, because he jumped onto her bed, turned 3 circles, and laid down with his chin on his paws and his eyes on Emma as if to say, "This is where I live now." "See," Emma told Jack. "He already knows he's home." Jack leaned against the door frame and watched his daughter and her poem, and the room painted purple with butterfly stickers on the walls, and the photograph on the nightstand of a woman on a highway who had promised her daughter that love was coming. And he thought about all the roads he'd traveled, the wrong ones and the right ones, the highways and the dead ends, and the long, lonely stretches of nothing. He thought about the iron wolves and the prison cells, and the nights when the darkness was so complete he'd forgotten that light existed. He thought about a diner and a cup of coffee, and 2 women talking at a counter about a little girl nobody wanted. He thought about walking into room 312 and being hugged by a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. Every road he'd ever traveled, every mistake he'd ever made, every terrible, beautiful, broken, impossible thing that had happened in 58 years of living had led him here, to this door frame, to this room, to this girl. Emma looked up from petting Captain and caught Jack watching her. She smiled that incandescent, unguarded, world-altering smile that had first reached into his chest in a hospital room and grabbed hold of his heart and refused to let go. "What are you thinking about, Daddy?" Jack Mercer, father, looked at his daughter and told her the truth. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am." Emma considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old philosopher. Then she nodded as if confirming something she'd always known. "You're not lucky, Daddy," she said. "You're loved." The spring evening settled over the apartment like a benediction. Captain snored softly on Emma's bed. Clara's quilt lay folded at the foot, in its mismatched squares, a patchwork of someone's patient hands. The photograph on the nightstand glowed faintly in the lamplight. 2 people on a highway, a beginning neither of them recognized until it came back around. Jack turned off the light, pressed a kiss to his daughter's forehead, and walked to the kitchen to make tomorrow's lunches. Peanut butter and jelly cut into triangles, crusts removed. Carrots, not peas. A chocolate milk for Emma. A coffee for himself. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary life. The most extraordinary thing he'd ever known.